I realise I'm only the token man on the panel. The number that's a lot of you thoughts.
He's a member of Parliament.
Obviously, if I thought the patient was entirely well, I wouldn't have hooked up with Lord Sainsbury in order to set up the Institute of Government, which is about trying to make government work better, including supporting the political class. I guess my answer, in essence, is that yes, it is quite sick, but not for the reasons that you think. So, in terms of clearly we've got quite a we've got an audience here and a group here. Often, where many of us are focused on the day-to-day or even the last year or two of events, and it makes us think, oh, there's a great deal of things that are going on now in the current moment. And I actually think many of those turn out, or historically we'll view them as relatively peripheral, whereas there's a much longer and deeper changes which are occurring, which actually are much more damaging to the political class. So in terms of kind of myths, one example would be, well, the trust issue. So to quote a poll, 57% of the public, when asked in a Gallup poll, said that politicians were only in it for themselves or for their party. Well, that poll was 1945, when there was a government of national unity in the UK. If you look at trust politicians to tell the truth, it's bounced around at about 20%, just around for at least 30, 40 years. We don't trust politicians. We didn't trust them 10 years ago. We didn't trust them a long time ago. So that's all true. The key issues actually is I'll get on to a second, when you ask about politicians and parties. Similarly, political interest. We've been tracking this for a very long time, and basically it hasn't changed, certainly since the early 70s. In the simple political interest questions in the UK. Actually, the UK is we are a particularly disinterested lot compared to other OECD nations, but that's been true for a long time. On the other hand, I do think there are some other issues which tend to get less attention, which in many ways are more worrying. So the biggest trend in many ways is how we feel about political parties. Party identification has fallen in many countries, but it's fallen particularly sharply in the UK. Party membership, of course, has fallen enormously over the last sort of 50 years. It used to be about 1 in 10. It's a tiny fraction of about 1 in 50 at best today. Party identification not only is falling somewhat, it's become much more unstable. In other words, people even say they identify with a party. Of course, you ask them the same question, they identify with a different party 5 years later. So it's more unstable. There's a lot of focus often on turnout in elections. To me, much more worrying than that, actually, is the contrast between the social skew in election turnout, which is substantial. Of course, the age skew is even larger. But there's been a rise, actually, in what's sometimes called protest or alternative activities. And quite a marked rise over the last 30 years. Well, that is very, very socially skewed. So it's quite a modest difference, actually, in turnout comparison. Whereas if you look at, of course, writing to your MP or a myriad of other kinds of activities, the differences are normally more like fivefold difference, even tenfold in some of them, between people who, for example, got a degree and who haven't. And of course, so what happens is that the thing with modest social skew has gone down a bit, whereas the thing which actually we do more of has gone up enormously. So it means that political representation across those different kinds of trends has shifted in a very deeply way. There's some other issues. Clearly, the PM attracts more focus now than he did compared to, or she did in the past, relative to other ministers and so on. Why does all that stuff matter? One of the reasons why it matters, of course, is all our institutions were based on those previous assumptions. So you build parliaments on the basis of certain kinds of political parties, and if their base has changed, that sort of should matter somewhat. Certainly on social skew, we should be very concerned about. The PM focus even. So we've got a situation where, in terms of the media, the profile given to the PM much higher than in previous generations. But actually, if you look at our institutional architecture, in Whitehall, we have a very, very small, a very, very small underpowered centre. You might find it remarkable, but compared to many countries. Anyway, so it all looks pretty odd in that way. I suppose for me, just two concluding comments. One is that we have to solve our kind of deep collective action problems one way or another, right? So it doesn't matter that we don't trust politicians. That's entirely appropriate. It can be an adversarial system, but we ought to at least be able to trust our institutions where they battle with one another. Or otherwise we have to find other ways of solving our kind of collective action problems. It's not a zero-sum game. So, a big issue in policy wonk central, where I spend a lot of my life, is behaviour change, right? Which is often about personal responsibility. But many of the things you want to do in personal responsibility, you actually have to kind of reach a collective consensus that that's what you want to do. I mean, banning of smoking was actually done fairly centrally, but most of those things, if we think about in the future, it'd be pretty odd for a central government to say, actually, we've decided we're going to ban smoking. It's much more likely that we'll have some kind of mechanism where we get together through some deliberative form, so we say, actually, we collectively have decided we want to make this shift on smoking. So in other words, they give permission to politicians to do things that otherwise they couldn't do. But I suppose most fundamentally, I mean, the political class is us, not just us in this room, but about, we start about collective action problems in everyday life and so on. And one of the key factors that explains the effectiveness of governance isn't voting and so on, or even the nuts and bolts of governance. It's a simple variable which is about social trust, actually. It's just, do you think other people can be trusted? You want to explain variations in governance effectiveness across countries. It's explained by that simple question about how we feel about each other as citizens. And why does that, it's because actually there's no good passing laws if no one's going to follow them, and we don't recycle if someone else doesn't do it. And of course, actually, this population of political class is drawn from amongst us, our population. So to me, the fact that actually one of the marked trends in the UK is the decline in social trust, the extent to which we trust each other as citizens, certainly from the 1990s, in many ways is more worrying than some of the headline things that we talk about. So in sum, I go for, we do have some deep problems, but they're not actually just to do with the latest expenses sort of scandal.